like to welcome you all. We have a constellation of experts in this session. The gentlemen will be talking about a number of issues that relate to the Iranian agreement and the regional and international repercussions. We are joined by Dr. Imad Khadduri, who will be talking about the technical perspective of the Iranian nuclear program and how the framework agreement has perhaps violated some of the aspects of the sovereignty of Iran. He will be talking about the losers and the winners. We have as well Dr. Abdulwahhab al-Qassab, who will be talking about the implications of the agreement for the geostrategic formations of the Arab Levant in this regard, and the rapprochement between Iran and the USA, the potential rapprochement. And Dr. Mahmoud Salameh will be talking about the oil and Iran's nuclear program, the impact on oil prices and the global oil market, and the return of Iran to the market. We've got also Dr. Hamid Dabashi, who will be talking about the competition between Israel and Iran and the position of the Arabs amongst such competition. I would like to thank all the experts and call upon Dr. Imad Khadduri to talk about the nuclear Iranian dossier. Dr. Imad Khadduri is an Iraqi nuclear scholar. He worked in Iraq for 30 years, and he, in 2004, issued a book about the mirage of the WMD. I would like to call upon Dr. Imad to talk about this issue. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. The Iranian sovereignty, in accordance with the framework agreement, has a number of technical repercussions that relate to the sovereignty of Iran itself. It has been 7 years since the start of the negotiations between Iran and the P5+1, which has led, on the 2nd of April, has led to the declaration of the framework agreement in Lausanne, which was described by the State Department as a joint comprehensive action plan. I have certain links in the presentation, and you can consult the links. Indeed, on the 30th of June, the agreement might be concluded. In accordance with such agreement, it has transpired that Iran has indeed, to a great extent, achieved most of its objectives vis-à-vis its peaceful nuclear program, which has started the beginning of the 90s of the past century. And it had culminated in the comprehensive agreement. I would like to depend on certain technical evidence to show what I have described earlier. Indeed, we have a number of titles or components of such agreement. I'll touch upon such elements throughout my paper. The latest agreement is emblematic of the conviction of the P5+1 vis-à-vis the nuclear peacefulness of the Iranian program. And they have tried to ring-fence perhaps this agreement with certain conditions in order to secure that Iran will follow the same path and not follow the military path. However, at the same time, this has led to a dent of the claim of Iran of the complete sovereignty over its own nuclear facilities. The extent of this dent is as follows. In this paper, I would like to talk about two concessions. I think that Iran has conceded some of its sovereignty. The first is to do with the agreement of Iran, which has not been touched upon in the comprehensive agreement. Iran has agreed for Russia to build its own nuclear facilities in the future. And indeed, this has affected the desire of Iran negatively vis-à-vis the confinement of its fuel and development of its own capacity to design the facilities, as well as the other reactors as it planned, especially when it comes to the nuclear spent fuel. The second component of this dent is to do with the destruction of the core of the Arak reactor. I would like to touch upon these two issues in order to prove my evidence. However, I would like to talk about some scientific terminology in this paper. It will be beneficial to introduce them first. Enrichment. Uranium-235 in nature amounts to nearly less than 1%, i.e. 0.7%, and 99.3% relates to uranium-238. The uranium-235 is the weapons grade one, which is used for the bomb. The enrichment process increases this percentage, whereby the uranium-235 would become 5% or 4 to 5%, which allows, at this case, to use the core of the reactor in order to end up having a bomb. The other part of the equation leads to a sub-element. The U-238 would resemble less than 0.7%, and we call it here the depletable uranium. And this uranium is used in some elements of the program, and this might cause cancer when it is used. The uranium-235 might reach the percentage of 20%, whereby 20% can be uranium-235 and 80% uranium-238, and this product can be used to run small-sized kind of reactors. Small-sized, I mean, with a lower capacity, in order to produce isotopes or radioactive isotopes, which are used in medicine and industry and agriculture. When it comes to the nuclear weapon, uranium-235 ought to reach 90% of enrichment. When we talk about the enrichment process, there are a number of methods that are followed in order to upgrade the percentage of the uranium-235. One of which depends on the capacity of the physical centrifuges, whereby the particles or the heavy particles can be detached from the low weight particles because it revolves around the center in a very speedily kind of manner in a cylinder. The velocity is between 50 and 70 rounds per minute, 50 and 70,000 rounds per minute. And the uranium, the natural one, will resemble the uranium fluoride gas. In this breakneck speed and the power of the physical centrifuge, the particles which are of lower weight can inch closer to the core of the cylinder and it floats. However, the heavier ones of the uranium-238 might inch closer to the walls of the cylinder and they can sink down. These cylinders, as you can see, are arranged in a BD manner, in a successive manner, whereby the uranium-235 that is enriched from the first cylinder can be sent to the second, then to the third, and so on and so forth, so that it can be enriched further. And this gas, when it passes through these cylinders, the uranium enrichment might reach the target 5% or 20% or 80% in accordance with the target. So the same method is followed, but the percentage differs. When it comes to the uranium, the 5% uranium or the 20% uranium was the political sovereign. It was a sovereign objective for Iran. But now Iran is dispensing with the stockpile, is getting rid of the stockpile. The question is why? We go back to 1967. 50 years ago, when the research reactor that was given to Iran as a present with a capacity of 5 megawatt in the Tehran University with having an enriched uranium to the tune of 20%. I would like to attract your attention to the 20% enrichment capacity. It was the prelude of the nuclear Iranian dossier by and large. This reactor was designated for nuclear research and the usage of certain channels, and this reactor has been used indeed time and time again, and it was very important for the production of the radioactive isotopes to treat the cancer, whereby it was used in Iran exponentially throughout the last 3 decades, as well as in the industry and the agriculture domain. More important is that this uranium in 1967 was not enough to operate this reactor for more than 40 years, up to 2010. If Iran had to find new fuel to carry on running this reactor, then it ought to seek different channels. Undoubtedly, this objective, obtaining 20% of the enrichment capacity in 30 years, as well as other political and security kind of issues that I won't touch upon, and the objective of the self-sufficiency of the nuclear fuel to run these reactors. All these reasons have contributed to the decision of Iran that was taken in the 90s of the last century. The sovereign decision to launch an ambitious nuclear program whereby the 20% was a prerequisite of meeting the target or the goals of the peaceful nuclear program of Iran, allegedly. And indeed, Iran has met this target, especially by cunning and procrastination. Indeed, it has been playing a very important role in this regard, and indeed it's dispensed with the 5% and the 20% of enriched uranium, and it has produced a number of uranium that exceed the need, whereby it had in place a trade-off par excellence. It has traded the low uranium with other kind of uranium, and it reduced the capacity of the production in order to get to the framework agreement to assure the continuation of the nuclear program. I would like to give you a brief outline of this nuclear program. I will come back to this chart, especially when it comes to the 20% enriched uranium throughout my paper. The obtainment of the enriched uranium by Iran. Iran has benefited greatly from the harsh experience of Iraq when the invading forces have destroyed the facilities of Iraq and its nuclear program in 1991. Iran has resorted to the technology of centrifuges in order to get the enriched uranium. The capacity of centrifuges has certain advantages, especially when it comes to the small size of the centrifuges, and as we've seen the cylinders earlier in the slide, it is on a par with the height of a human being, and as well as the ease of its concealment in certain buildings or certain facilities, the like of Natanz. When these facilities were unraveled, then it went underground, like Fordo facility or Fordo reactor near to the city of Qom. These two locations, were included in the agreement. Indeed, Fordo is in the heart of a mountain and it will not be used anymore. Natanz, which has been declared earlier by Iran, it will be transformed perhaps into a research facility, and it will be using only 5,000 centrifuges out of the 19,000. The centrifuges were resorted to in the last decade of the previous century, and the technology was reached out from Pakistan. the objective was the enrichment capacity by 5%. Iran wanted to prove to the world that the program was peaceful, and thus it launched a negotiation process with Brazil, and it had a trade-off in place, 1,200 kilograms of enriched uranium to the tune of 5%. Iran, it was at this stage, as you can see on the slide, and here we are talking about the amounts. So 1,200 kilograms of 5% enriched uranium of 120 kilogram to the tune of 20% of enriched uranium that Iran used in the facilities in the University of Tehran. In light of such trade-off, Iran said that it will not increase the percentage of the enrichment more than 5% because it wanted to prove that it had good offices when it received the 120 kilograms of 20%. In Turkey, Turkey played the role of a broker between Brazil and Iran. However, in the mid of 2010, the USA jumped on the bandwagon and it stopped the negotiation process conclusively. Iran, in return, took the decision of the usage of the centrifuges, and indeed it wanted to increase the percentage of the enrichment from 5% to 20%. It has started here in 2010. And engineers, or its engineers, had in place fuel rods to the tune of 20%, and they were successful in 2012 in the University of Tehran. It was a very complicated process, but Iran met its target in 2012. Iran wanted to have a sovereign nuclear policy. Now, how this sovereignty was dented. Iran, for the last decades, said that its nuclear activities will equip it to get to the peaceful usage of the uranium. It wanted to mine the uranium and to have the yellow cake from such mining, as well as enriching the uranium and getting into the fuel, as well as the design and the running of the nuclear facilities, as well as the stockpiling of the spent fuel, as well as having in place all the activities, independence on its capacities, its engineers and scholars. However, these two activities were written off, and indeed the sovereignty was dented, as I said in my first slide. Within few days before the Lausanne negotiations in Vienna, in October, in Moscow, an agreement was declared whereby Russia can build and run 8 electronuclear facilities under the umbrella of the IAEA. Indeed, Russia can import these fuel rods, and they can reinstate them. These two conditions were written off. Indeed, this resembled a concession by Iran. It has dented the sovereignty of Iran, where it said that their program will be purely national in the past. In addition to that, and here there's a very important point, this framework agreement has reduced the benefit of the production of the enriched uranium to the tune of 5% as fuel for the nuclear facilities in the future, because the fuel of the 8 would be nuclear capacities will be Russian. So the percentages will not play a role, as the media says, vis-à-vis the concession of Iran and the reduction of the centrifuges from 19,000 to 5,000. It will not need such capacities for the oncoming 15 years, because the fuel will be the job of the Russians. Iran has agreed to some of the concessions. As I said, there were 2 points in the enrichment paragraph. As you can see on the slide, Iran has agreed to dispense with its stockpile, but this was vague. The agreement didn't say how, but this might be explained at the end of June. This item, reactors and reprocessing, if you could focus on this term, indefinitely. Iran has committed indefinitely to not conduct reprocessing or reprocessing research and development on spent nuclear fuel, whereby plutonium or weapons-grade plutonium cannot be produced anymore. Indefinitely, it means indefinitely. It means an open-ended kind of condition. I'll just jump to the last slide. I would like to pose a question: why Iran has put into place the Arak reactor that produces plutonium, and why now it agreed to destroy the core of the reactor? In Iran, the design of the Arak with a capacity of 40 megawatt has taken place 20 years ago, until it was uncovered. Some of the opposition leaders in Paris unraveled the matter. In 2014, it ought to be concluded. However, this has been halted because of the transit agreement in 2013, which stipulated that Iran must destroy the core of this current reactor and to transform this core in accordance with the agreement of the P5+1. This kind of reactors uses the uranium, the natural uranium, the unenriched ones, and the heavy water, which is very complicated and very costly. And having 40 megawatts as capacity, it will indeed produce the weapon-grade plutonium. This kind of reactor is on a par with the Dimona Parisian or French reactor, as well as the Canadian Indian reactor, and the same as the Pakistan Qassab nuclear reactor. The technical pretext of Iran for choosing such a reactor is to do with the exploitation of scientific research, as well as the production of the radioactive isotopes to use it in the medical domain. Because there is no enriched uranium, then it will be the alternative or plan B in this regard, in case the other paths fall flat, i.e. the trade-off with Brazil to have enriched uranium to the tune of 20%, as well as to the use of the centrifuges. Here we're talking about 1995. They were not convinced that the uranium enrichment will take place. So this was Plan B, this kind of reactor. The question is, how could the Iranians get the heavy water? The gentleman is answering, saying that next to Iraq, the Iranian scholars had in place a facility to produce 16 tons of the heavy water annually, and the Iranians themselves did so. And they have such capacity nowadays. Iran has reiterated the objective of the building of such reactor in 2013. And in Tashkent in 2014, they had in place a clandestine item which stipulates that this will not be built and the fuel rods will not be built. But this did not convince anyone, and I personally was not convinced why Iran wants the weapons-grade plutonium. The Lausanne Agreement indeed concluded the matter, and they prohibited Iran from the production of plutonium. I'll go to the conclusion. Please allow me. I'm sorry I took much of your time. In accordance with the agreement with Russia 6 months ago, in October 2014, Russia has pledged to build the electro-nuclear facilities, and it leads to the lack of the necessity of running parts of the nuclear reactors to have in place the enriched uranium and to freeze numerous peaceful activities for 10 or 15 years, as well as the destruction of the core of the Iraq national reactor in accordance with the Lausanne framework. It is feasible to say that the sovereignty alleged nuclear policy of Iran was dented or was perhaps curbed. The Minister of Energy in the US, and he is a nuclear physician as well, he said this framework is indefinite and it has no time limit. He said that it is perpetual in accordance with it is a forever agreement, obviously, in a certain sense, with different stages. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Imad. This is my email address. If you want the paper with all the references, please refer to my website and my email address. Thank you very much, Dr. Khadduri, for this very valuable presentation. I really wished I could give you more time because there are many important details that all of us would like to familiarize ourselves with, but we have no time for that. I move to our second presenter, Dr. Abdulwahhab al-Qassab. He will be presenting on the geopolitical side. He is a former brigadier general in the Iraqi armed forces and the Iraqi Navy when he retired, and he's been research with many international organizations, and he got his PhD from Campbell University, and now currently he is a fellow at our center. Please, Dr. Imad has taken more of his time, so please try to stick to the time. I'll be as brief as I can and save you some time. Assalamu alaikum, first of all. The theme I'll be discussing is related to the geostrategic aspects and the international relations is highly complex. Simply to deconstruct it into its fundamental principles takes a long time. I entitled my paper the implications of agreement for the geostrategic formation of the Arab Levant because it's related to the many different reactions which are currently in play in the area, and all the power relations will impact the interrelations between the different powers. I don't want to spend any time on providing definitions, but simply the reactions between power relations and interrelations lead to what we call as geostrategic formation, which in turn is a reflection of the different variables in the power relations. The geostrategic formation is impacted by the critical mass and many other considerations which, when research is conducted into any alignment and as a result of the converging and diverging national purposes of different countries. In a brief and historically speaking, there has been some sort of an alignment and polarization in this part of the world, which almost finished or the beginning of the end with the Iranian Revolution. Before 1979, the Nixon Templar strategy used to govern, twin pillar strategy was used to govern the geopolitical situation, and the United States wanted to, on the one hand, stop the Soviet expansion, relying on two pillars, Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that period has witnessed arming these countries with the latest weapons. But Iran of the Shah in that time, it was at that time when Iran signed the nuclear agreements with West Germany, and as a result of which the Bushehr nuclear reactor came into existence. But Saudi Arabia, with its well-known deliberate and quiet diplomacy, and although it has received huge amounts of weaponry, but it did not reflect on its foreign policy. But this situation, from the point of view of geostrategic formation, was the Arab Zionist polarization. And although, despite the differences between the Arab countries at that time, they used to form a Bloc A, which was against Bloc B, which is the Zionist entity. The change came with the Iranian Revolution, when it started exporting revolution, which Iraq has managed to put an end to in the Iran-Iraq war, and if it's immediate afterwards, until the invasion of Iraq 2003, because this rivalry and also the Iraq's ability to counteract Iran was there, despite the weakness of Iraq at that time. Iraq was still able to challenge Iran despite the Iran-Iraq war and the destruction Iraq has witnessed as a result of the invasion of Kuwait, until until the invasion of Iraq, where Iraq, as a result of the Iranian expansion, was severely weakened. And after 2003, the polarization moved from Arab Zionist polarization into Arab Iranian polarization as a result of Iranian intervention with the demise of the Iraqi state and Iran's penetrating into Iraq, and this became more apparent with Iran's intervention in Syria, employing one of its arms in the region, Hezbollah, and the leadership of Hassan Nasrallah in Syria, and strengthen a group of militias. These militias in Iraq, which are not, they don't owe allegiance to the Iraqi government, but to Iran. When the ISIL extremists came into the picture, this provided some justification for Iranian intervention, of course. But this Iranian intervention has reached its maximum with the Houthis' attempt to control Yemen. Here we witnessed two changes. The first change was the decisive storm military campaign led by Saudi Arabia, and secondly, the negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program. And these two factors influenced each other, and we see how Saudi Arabia took the decision, and the decision was announced in Adel Jubair's press conference in Washington to the Western allies, and the administration had nothing else that it could do but to empathize with Saudi Arabia and express its understanding of the Saudi move. Although there has been a very clear reservations expressed by the European Union. This is on the one hand. On the other, the nuclear negotiations reached a very decisive stage whereby no outside influence should be allowed to influence it, because simply this agreement represented a strong need for Iran, and Dr. Khadduri has explained that. And also we should not ignore the fact that the Iranian public opinion and its disgruntlement towards the vast resources wasted on the nuclear program and on Iran's interventions, although Iran keeps calling that a source of its national pride, i.e. the nuclear issue. And in addition to that, we had other influences to provide some outcome to the negotiations. If we want to understand the geostrategic formation, or the new one, there are two, in fact. One could be for the best-case scenario, and it can be worst-case scenario. Both the worst and the best I'm looking at from the point of view of Arab. And what is best for us is worst for the Iranians and vice versa. And I'll try to shed light within the time allowed. In order to enable us to charter this new formation, we must first allude to the different threats faced by our region. And when the region, by it I mean the Arab Levant. And when we're talking about the Arab Levant, in fact, we are talking specifically about what the Arab world is facing, the Arab Levant, I tried to provide a definition for, and these are the Fertile Crescent, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan, plus Egypt, plus Arabian Peninsula, which is made up of the GCC countries, the 6 GCC countries, in addition to the Yemen. This bloc here acts as one factor which will be influenced by what's happening. Egypt provides the linkage to North Africa and Sudan and the African depth of the Arab world. So therefore, the entire Arab world will be impacted by the outcomes of this new geostrategic formation. Chief amongst these threats are the Zionist threat, although the situation has changed, but the Israeli threat reminds us of its presence every 2 or 3 years with an attack on Gaza or something like that. And of course, secondly, is the Iranian threat, which we do not really wish that it happened. This is a clear fact. It's part of reality, apparent in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and there's an attempt to penetrate into Egypt. And sometimes they called for calling for a ministry for Shiite affairs in Egypt, or Iranian guardianship of the Shiite shrines in Egypt. These are not new. We hear them in Iraq and elsewhere every day. The other threat, which is the normal or usual threats you use as a result of friction between neighboring blocs or countries. And there's also the water security, like the Nahda Dam in Ethiopia. But in fact, there are hundreds of little streams which run into Iraqi territory that Iran started blocking even from the days of the Shah, which impacted the water levels in the Tigris River. And in fact, this has increased although the current regime in Iraq is an ally to Iran, Iran has increased these activities. The other serious threat is the disintegration or the dismantlement of Arab society on the lines of factionism and sectarianism. These Arab societies used to view themselves as Arabs first, and then came their religious affiliation, whether they are Muslim, Christian, Druze, or Shiite, or whatever. Now, this sub-identity is taking over the main identity as a result of Iranian attempts to export revolution in a way that can provide a recipe for moving into a better scenario, or best case scenario. Also, energy, which is rather strange, because this area is the hub for energy, but it can be a source of threat when the international maritime sea lanes are affected. We know Iran conducts at least 4 or 5 exercises and maneuvers in the Hormuz Straits. And second energy threat is the threat faced by petrol installation, electricity generation facilities, Of course, these lines of communications through the Hormuz Straits and Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and we know, of course, the Oman Gulf is still under Iranian Navy control. But if you want to go to move or any pipelines to be moved to the ports are faced with threats, and this should be taken into consideration with the new the formation of the new geostrategic alignments. This brings me to discussing how capabilities are discussed when on paper there is a clear advantage enjoyed by the Arab countries and specifically by the GCC countries when it comes to regular, classic, and conventional warfare. In comparison, when it comes to asymmetric warfare, Iranians have the advantage. So here we see an advantage. There are some 10,000 small combat fighting boats which can invade. This is the Akbar Navy Armada, and that can assemble. And if that was ever used by Iran, then this only 5 of these boats loaded with dynamite can hit an aircraft carrier or something and cause a lot of damage. So therefore, the Iranian, for example, Iranian Air Force capabilities compared to the Gulf air warfare capabilities, the GCC countries have a clear advantage, and they can easily have an advantage from a point of view of time. For example, you cannot rely on a MiG-19 or MiG-21 made in China or Korea to fight an F-16 or an F-18. Or you cannot rely a T-55 tank, which has to be refilled after 400 kilometers on an Abrams A1 tank. This vast gap in technological advances and capabilities. For example, the F-18 can destroy any aircraft which is still on the ground or while taking off because of the range of the air-to-air missiles it carries. When the decisive storm was waged, a new hope was provided that we as Arabs can say to the world that we are here, we do exist, and we can. If the Saudi Navy redeploys from the Red Sea and came to the Gulf of Oman, would change the equation, the balance of power, giving Saudi a clear advantage. And of course, I should not forget that Iran has submarines and the Arabs do not. And this is an advantage. Of course, Iran has the AWACS capabilities and through Orion airplanes, and Saudi Arabia has the AWACS early warning systems. So therefore, if we take into consideration two factors. First, when this kind of power was used to convince the other party that there is a real force which can challenge its projects, we will have what we call a strategy of deterrence or a theory of deterrence. And if the other side decides that the other side has a deterrent force, they can reach some sort of coexistence, and this coexistence can allow both sides to be, and this is the best case scenario. If we wanted to take a closer look at this best case scenario and to deconstruct it, we must see the Arabs should ally themselves with themselves, but we have two exceptions, Iraq and the Assad regime in Syria, and we have some people express Bashar al-Assad. And we have, of course, people who express preservation. We have one is represented by Oman and also Algeria. But when the ability is established, then the number of the powers which express themselves as having reservations rather, the number of these will decrease. So this is what we should do, and the decisive storm should reach its ends and should not be stopped. There are many attempts now to end it on the grounds of humanitarian intervention and otherwise. Decisive storm should be allowed to reach its declared goals so that the other side will be convinced that it's not able to take a military campaign right to the end. I think the Iranian public opinion does not want this engagement with the Arabs, and it wants to focus its attentions internally. We have seen, of course, there is one country which, like Pakistan, first expressed its willingness first, but then changed its mind, maybe due to Iranian pressure. But this is an important country, and this is a nuclear power, a tried and tested nuclear power. Turkey is being more positive, so therefore the region is supporting the Arab bloc more than the Iranian bloc. Iran's allies are known, the ruling regimes of Iraq and Syria, and we would actually ask a question. Why have you? We understand that you sided with the Bashar al-Assad regime, but why side with the Houthis, for example? So therefore, this is the best case. Now, if we move to the worst case scenario, is for everything to collapse, and the nuclear agreement has added an advantage to Iran to update its weapon system because it did not have the monies in the past. Now it will have it, and it will focus all its attentions on rearmament, and Iran can say that it had a safe-facing formula, and the Arabs are occupied with their own problems, and this allows to focus its attentions on its own issues. Also, there is the other possibility of Iran's interfering militarily when it sees its allies unable to stand up to the pressures of decisive storm. A third possibility is the failure of the military campaign. And of course, number four, Iran deciding to agitate its allies, internal allies, like it has shown in the past with Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis, and the Bashar al-Assad regime. After that, if this happens, then when we move to another more serious stage, whereby Iran interfering in the internal affairs of the GCC, similarly to its attempt on Bahrain, and also this is another possibility, of course, which will act as a negative factor against the Arabs. Also, if some members of the military alliance within the GCC, we have Oman, which did not take part. Maybe if one of the remaining five decides that they had enough and we should move into negotiations, and the whole alliance collapses as a result of which there is a lot of details here, but I ran out of time, and I'm ready to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Abdulwahhab. We'll move to Dr. Mamdouh Salameh. He's an international oil economist. He will be talking about the oil and Iran's nuclear program, impact on oil prices and the global oil market. Mr. Mamdouh is an international oil economist and a World Bank consultant on oil and energy. Salameh is currently visiting professor of energy economics at the London campus of ECCP. Today, I shall be talking about the needs of Iran vis-à-vis the nuclear energy and the real reasons of the plummeting prices of oil and the repercussions on the GCC countries and the global economy. Then move to talk about the effect of lifting the sanctions on Iran and the repercussions on the oil. The oil is at the heart of Iran's nuclear program. Iran needs nuclear energy to replace the crude oil and natural gas currently. Perhaps by 2020 it will become a small exporter. Undoubtedly, Iran do not oppose having nuclear weapons, and it says it is to do with the security pretext, and it's a logical one. The logic says that if Israel, India, Pakistan, and North Korea can defy the world and get away with it, why not Iran? And if you worry about Iran's nuclear program, one important fact is being overlooked. Iran's proven oil reserves have been greatly overstated. The US government has argued strongly that a country so apparently well endowed with oil and natural gas as Iran cannot have any legitimate need to develop nuclear energy. However, when the USA has helped the Shah in 1974 to launch the nuclear energy program, Iran's produced 6 million barrels almost double the present production, and indeed its consumption was less than a quarter of consumption today, and the population was half of what it is now. So the question is, since the United States strongly supported the Shah to build the nuclear power in 1974, why it is opposing the nuclear program now? The answer is that in the 70s, the Shah was the closest friend to Israel. However, nowadays Iran is not a friend with Israel. Iran's crude oil production had 6 million barrels per day during the Shah era. However, now it has been reduced to the tune of 3.15 million barrels in 2014, and it was successful in exporting only 1 million. Iran claims to have proven reserves of 157 billion barrels. This what Oil and Gas Journal has stipulated at the BBC Statistical Review for World Energy in 2014. However, these figures were Iran's official figures published by the Oil and Gas Journal and BBC Statistical Review with scrutiny. Samsan Bakhtiari and Ali Saidi, they are two experts, very prominent experts in Iran. They worked in the National Oil Company, said that the reserves of Iran is to the tune of 36 billion barrels. I had in place some studies about the reserves since the discovery of the oil, and I took into consideration the exports and the internal consumption, and I ended up having in mind that the number is only 30 billion. Iran is one of 9 countries that reached the apex or the peak of the production of oil in 2000 and in 1974, and then things went pear-shaped. Given the problems in its oil field and the difficulties that Iran is facing, especially the harms inflicted at the time of the Shah, when Iran used to produce 6 million barrels a day, we think that the nuclear power is necessary for Iran. In 2012, Iran has used 620 barrels to produce electricity, and this year it will use 770,000 barrels a day. This might be saved if the electricity can be produced through its nuclear program. Sanctions imposed on Iran has been harmful to the currency. However, Iran is still producing oil. We know that the Security Council has not decided to stop Iran completely from the production of oil. However, the resolutions have curbed such exports. For example, they had on place certain sanctions on the insurance companies, and they have imposed as well stringent sanctions on the banks, whereby Iran cannot have the revenues of its exports. Could the Arab Gulf oil producers bypass the Strait of Hormuz in case Iran has closed it if there is a war? The answer is as follows. Through the Strait of Hormuz, 17 million barrels a day pass through from the GCC countries, and there are 3 pipelines to transport the Arab oil outside the vicinity of the Strait of Hormuz. One of them is the Iraqi-Turkish pipeline. It is nearly has been halted and it had a capacity of 1.6 million barrels. It is not used, but if it is used, we had in place 400,000, and there's also the Petroline Saudi pipeline of the capacity of 4.8 million, and there are 2 million barrels that are used through this pipe. What I would like to say that the GCC countries can have in place 7.8 million barrels a day outside the Strait of Hormuz. The United Arab Emirates had in place pipeline that avoids completely the Strait of Hormuz, and the capacity is 1.5 million barrels a day. What is left is 9 million that ought to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. If it is closed, then this means that 9 million barrels from the Gulf exports will not pass through, and consequently, this will lead to the hikes in the price of oil might reach $150. But Iran did not embark on such step unless it is banned from exporting oil. Up to this moment, I said that there is no resolution that stops the exports. Yes, it curbs the exports, but it does not ban it completely. What are the reasons of the recent plummeting of the prices in the oil? The crude oil price has lost 54% of its value since September 2014. It is $57 per barrel nowadays. And the reasons given were that there is a glut in the global oil market because of the fracking procedures in America and because of the shale gas in the USA. And there's also the slowdown in the economic growth in China and the EU. But from my own opinion, I think that this glut to the tune of 1 to 2 million barrels a day and the slow growth of the economic growth in China cannot justify this plummeting prices. If we took the face of it, especially when it comes to the decision of OPEC to not reduce its production, I think, and I would say that there is a political connivance behind the drop, and the aim is to inflict harm on Russia and Iran. What are the impact of such low prices of oil on the global economy? The global economy cannot reconcile itself with low oil prices for a long time because the main ingredients of the global economy, such as global investments and the world oil industry and the economies of the oil producing countries, would be undermined. The challenges facing the global economy are to do with the curtailment of the global investments as well as the decline, the huge decline of such investments. There is also another reason, i.e., the 7 multinationals or the major oil companies need $125 or $130 per barrel in order to have a break-even price in their budgets. In January 2015, the 3 major companies, Schlumberger, Halliburton, and Baker Hughes, said that there is a decrease in the investments to the tune of 25 or 30% in North America compared with 10 or 15% in the rest of the world. And they said that there is a drop. This is a very important index. It is to do with the drop of 687 rigs, or 43% of drop in the number of the rigs drilling for shale oil in the USA from October 2014 to March. And the reason being the prices, the shale gas or the shale oil requires 50 to 70 dollar so that it can be business kind of feasible. There are some production companies in America that can cope with a price to the tune of 50 to 60 per barrel. However, most of the producers cannot cope. They need the break-even price of 70 to $85. What is the impact of the plummeting prices on the Arab Gulf oil producers? The Arab oil producers have already lost $122 billion in reduced oil export revenues in 2014 in Q2 or in the second half of the year. They are projected to lose $234 billion rather in 2015 if the price does not rise above $60 per barrel. Saudi Arabia has reduced the state expenditure to the tune of 18%, and it asked from Saudi Aramco to reduce the expenditure on mining and to the tune of 25%. And albeit Saudi Arabia has led the OPEC to not reducing the production. Standard & Poor, a rating agency, said that the Saudi Arabia outlook has been affected by the decline if the decline is prolonged. Some of the OPEC countries need very high oil prices to break even in their budgets. They need oil prices of more than $100. Iran needs $130 for the break-even price. However, Saudi Arabia needs $106 for the break-even price, and this has been increased. It was $98 in the previous year. This chart clarifies the needs of the OPEC members vis-à-vis the oil prices. In 2014 or in 2013, the income of the GCC countries from the oil revenues was to the tune of nearly $500 billion. In the second term, it has been reduced to 465, and this year it will be 340 billion. So what is the benefit from not reducing the production by OPEC? Some people say, why do you ask the OPEC to reduce the production whereby some countries refuse? This is not true. If OPEC reduces the production by 2 million barrels a day, then Russia will follow suit by 500,000 and Mexico by 300,000. So this decrease might indeed absorb all the glut that we're facing. The GCC countries consume 6 million barrels per day. That means 31% of their oil production. And this is increasing. This consumption goes mainly to generate electricity and the power water desalination plants. Currently, we have 199 desalination plants in the GCC countries, and there are also 38 to be built. Consequently, these plants depend on the oil, and thus the consumption is colossal. This means that the GCC countries will have to cut their domestic oil consumption drastically or replace oil by nuclear power and solar energy, electricity generation, and water desalination. Otherwise, by 2030, they will be small exporters, 1.5 million barrel per day, and by 2030, the consumption, internal consumption, will be on a par with its production, perhaps more. Thus, it will not become major exporters of oil. So these countries need diversification. However, what kind of diversification I'm talking about? It has nothing to do with buying real estate or casinos or hotels in Europe and America. I'm talking about embarking on the investments of the production of food. I mean, Sudan. Sudan is ranked third in terms of the agricultural land, and it has huge water resources. If the GCC countries does this, if the GCC countries do this, then it can indeed save a huge amounts of money, whereby it imports food nowadays from the USA, and Sudan is capable of providing a food basket to these countries, and indeed they can also export the surplus. Within the next 20 or 30 years, the commodity prices will surpass the oil prices because of the demographic changes and the landscape changes. And there's also another diversification whereby solar power, along with nuclear energy, could provide all electricity needs of the Gulf countries. If the GCC countries embarked on the usage of the solar power, then they can have desalination plants in the Arab Sea, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea, not only to drink, however, to secure the food security, and will save huge amounts of money of investments in the USA. What is the impact of sanctions and declining oil prices on Russia? I said that the decrease in prices targeted Iran and Russia. I would like just to be brief. I would say that when it comes to the effect on Russia, it affected Russia badly on the currency, but Russia is a major country. It can weather the storm more than GCC countries because Russia depends on the revenue of oil and gas to the tune of 45% of its budget. However, the GCC countries depend on the oil to the tune of 85 to 90% of its budget. So, as I talked about the influence of the decline of prices on the shale oil industry, I can say that the reduction of the oil, albeit it affected the shale production, however, the shale oil production, the American one, is a reality, and we need to tackle such reality because if the prices are to be increased, then the shale oil industry will increase. However, there is a problem when it comes to the depletion of the shale oil wells will reach 70 to 90%. So America needs to drill thousands and thousands of wells in order to keep the same production in comparison with the Arab wells that are sustained for more than 20 years. To conclude, I'll come back to the nuclear deal and lifting of the sanctions. The Western media threatens and says that when the sanctions are lifted, then Iran will be capable of increasing the oil production. This is incorrect because the Iranian wells were or incurred harms. 4 million barrels was the average, but Iran was not up to the standards. Perhaps, yes, lifting the sanctions will help Iran to import the advanced American technology and the FDIs. However, this technology will help Iran to stop the depletion of the wells and not to increase the production. And thus I say that the capacity of Iran to the increase of the production does not exceed 200,000 or 300,000 barrels a day. But this cannot be translated into exports because the Iranian consumption, internal consumption, might absorb this amount. The conclusion is as follows. I think, in my view, if the sanctions are lifted and Iran was able to do so, then this will help Iran, but it will not increase the production. The oil plummeted prices is not good for the region, but I think that in this year the prices might reach $75 per barrel in the second half, and in 2016 it might retain all the losses. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Dr. Mamdouh Salameh. I'm sure that he had plenty of information, further information, but the time is tight. Indeed, he talked about the capacity of Iran and it reduced it from 157 to 30 billion. I don't know whether the Iranian brothers can be happy or not. Perhaps they will become a small size exporter. Anyway, the last speaker is Dr. Hamid Dabashi. Dr. Hamid is the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York. He has taught in many North and Latin America, Europe, Arab, and Iranian universities, and is a founding member of both the Institute for Comparative Literature and the Society and the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia University. Dabashi has also founded Dreams of a Nation, a Palestinian film project dedicated. Yes, the floor is yours, sir.
By thanking the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for kindly including me in this conversation, my good friend Marwan Kabalan, my distinguished colleague Dr. Azmi Bishara. I'm delighted to be here. My distinguished co-panelists have addressed issues pertaining to the technicalities of the nuclear and oil issue. I know nothing about the nuclear energy. The closest I come to nuclear energy is in the morning when I warm up my tea in the microwave. The paper that I'm about to present is an academic paper, the full text of which I will give to the Arab Center today. In the interest of time, I will only share some of the major themes. I must begin by saying that for somebody who comes from North America, I live in New York, it is absolutely necessary to hear the concerns of the region, in the Gulf region, in the larger Arab world, because it provides a corrective lens to what otherwise we know in Western Europe or North America. This corrective lens is absolutely necessary. However, I must also say I'm deeply concerned with the rise of the sectarian language and with the rise of ethnic nationalist language that I have heard over the last at least 2 months since the prospect of a nuclear deal with Iran has been in the offing. This language is very strange to my ears. Strange to my ears from the rise of the Iranian Revolution of 1977-79 to the rise of the Arab revolutions in 2011. And in my way of reading these revolutions have not ended. These are not total revolutions. These are open-ended revolutions, and they continue to reverberate. And it is the absolute and undeniable responsibility of Arab and Muslim intellectuals to sustain the hopes and democratic aspirations of those revolutions, and not to collapse into the overriding ethnic and sectarian language that the rivalry, regional rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia has infused into our language. I must say I'm deeply surprised to see that the Saudi-led invasion of Yemen is considered to be as an expression of the Arab will rather than, as I see it, as the culmination of the counter-revolutionary forces to put an end to the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Arab world. I think in his keynote plenary, Dr. Azmi Bishara pointed out to all the major issues that today the prospect of a nuclear agreement between P+1 and Iran pertains. It is quite obvious that the nuclear agreement has triggered deep anxieties that exist in all the regions. Beginning with the United States, it is important to remind ourselves that Obama administration's attempt for a diplomatic rapprochement with Iran, which, as Dr. Bishara said, is in line with similar development. For example, right now he's talking with the Cuban leadership, is deeply opposed not only by people like Sheldon Adelson and AIPAC, but also deep-rooted neocon forces within the United States. It is important to keep in mind that, for example, Senator Tom Cotton of Arizona, as late as 2 days ago, was calling for the bombing of Iran. That people of similar thinking, Bolton, just 2 weeks ago, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times vociferously arguing for bombing of Iran. So it is within the United States, the question of this deal with Iran is a matter that is between the so-called Obama doctrine, whatever that Obama doctrine is. Americans say, carry a big stick and speak softly. That seems to be the Obama doctrine. And the more warmongering aspects of the American political culture represented, for example, by the letter that Senator Tom Cotton, on behalf of 47 other Republican senators, sent to Iran. In the case of Israel, of course, it's quite evident. If you look at the last election in Israel, two factors were important in the election of Netanyahu. Number one, in his famous phrase that the Arabs are coming to vote by way of mobilization of his own constituency, and second, that Iran is an existential threat to Israel. Now, in the region, in this region, I believe there is a legitimate concern about the increasing influence of Iran in various Arab countries, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Yemen, in Bahrain, etc. These, in my opinion, are perfectly legitimate concerns. However, it is our responsibility to have a realistic assessment of this influence. In my opinion, it is within the DNA of Islamic Republic not to generate crisis, but to take advantage of crisis. And this begins with the history of Islamic Republic itself, with the US hostage crisis. Ayatollah Khomeini was not responsible for the students' takeover of the American embassy. But once the American embassy was taken, something that could have ended in 2 days or 2 weeks, then he banked on it, prolonged it for 444 days, and it is imperative to see what happened in Iran during those 444 days. As the world attention was diverted to 70 plus diplomatic corps of Americans in the embassy, the first presidential election was first of all, the first referendum was held. People were given two choices, for or against Islamic Republic. Second, the first presidential election was took place. The parliamentary election took place. The writing of the Constitution took place. The infusion of the Velayat al-Faqih into the constitution. Up until the summer of 1978, there was no talk of the Velayat Faqih infusion. It is in the aftermath of the Iranian secular intellectuals at Tehran University beginning to item by item discuss the constitution, the first draft of the constitution, that Khomeini got concerned and introduced the factor of Velayat Faqih. The next crisis is the crisis of Iran-Iraq war, 1918-1988. Khomeini could have ended that war at least within a year or 2 years, but he intentionally prolonged it. Now, we can debate who started the war. Saddam Hussein started the war or Khomeini started the war. But once the war started, Khomeini could have ended it, but he prolonged it for 8 years. Why did he prolong it for 8 years? In order to pacify the alternative voices of the revolution. In order to understand, Iranian revolution was not a sectarian revolution. It was a decidedly cosmopolitan revolution. How did it become a Shi'i revolution? With two factors. Internally, all the other voices were silenced during this hostage crisis and the Iran-Iraq war, mass execution of political prisoners, university purges, successive cultural revolutions. This is the process, internal process, that the cosmopolitan worldly Iranian revolution became sectarian revolution. But he was being aided and abetted, Khomeini was being aided and abetted by two forces. In the course of the Iran-Iraq war, it was not Ayatollah Khomeini, but Saddam Hussein who called the Iran-Iraq war the second Qadisiyya, not Ayatollah Khomeini. It was Saddam Hussein's rhetoric of second Qadisiyya, Salah Abu Saif in 1982 making a movie called Qadisiyya, that turned the Iranian revolution into, a cosmopolitan Iranian revolution, into a Persian revolution. Because once you bring a Qadisiyya into Arab nationalist phenomenon, suddenly a cosmopolitan Iranian revolution becomes a Persian revolution from this side. From the other side, when the formation of the Taliban with a decidedly Wahhabi ideology created by Brzezinski and others for two purposes. Number one, to kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and second, to resist the appeal of the Iranian revolution eastward, suddenly, by virtue of positing of a Sunni Wahhabi alternative in Afghanistan, again, the cosmopolitan Iranian revolution became a Shi'i revolution. So you posit an Arab nationalist phenomenon on one side of a cosmopolitan revolution, a Sunni Wahhabism on the other side of the same revolution. The revolution, which had global appeal at the time, throughout the world, particularly in the Arab world, became a sectarian revolution and began to do what it wanted to do. So it is not possible to forget about the geopolitics of the region in 1970s and consider the Iranian revolution as the beginning of a sectarian revolution. We have to remember, how did it become a sectarian revolution? The thinking that went into the formation of the Iranian revolution of 1977-79 can be traced to at least three moments. The anti-colonial nationalism Mossadegh in 1950s, Khomeini uprising of 1963, and the guerrilla uprisings of the Cherikhay Fadai Khalq in 1970s. The anti-colonial nationalism of Mossadegh was deeply rooted in Gamal Abdel Nasser's socialism and in Nehru's anti-colonial nationalism. We cannot forget the geopolitics of the region when Mossadegh's anti-colonial nationalism was launched. And that anti-colonial nationalism was integral to the revolutionary mobilizations of the 1970s. And who were the Fadaeins? The Fadaeins were in solid solidarity with the Palestinian national liberation, deeply rooted in the Palestinian national liberation. And they were all present in the course of the Iranian Revolution of 1977-79. So a bit of historicization of the Iranian Revolution of 77-79 is absolutely necessary for us to see how, in the course of the last 30 plus years, The ruling regime in Iran has systematically used and abused crises that are generated for its own advantage. 1982, Iran did not invade Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon. The combination of the Israeli invasion of 1982 in Lebanon and the disenfranchised Shia communities within the Lebanese politics created a condition for Iran to go to create Hezbollah. In 2001, Iran did not invade Afghanistan. US invaded Afghanistan. But again, as Dr. Bishara said, the condition, the ruins that the US, because US cannot do anything but bomb, as Israel, created an environment for Iran to go in and have an influence in Afghanistan. 2003, Iran did not invade Iraq. Colleagues, friends, comrades. US invaded Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis slaughtered in the aftermath of the US invasion. Nouri al-Maliki is Iraqi, is not Iranian. The condition that is created, Iran goes and begins to influence, and Qasem Soleimani now runs the Iraqi scene. The same is with the Syrian revolution. The same is with the condition in Yemen. Iran is adept in soft power. In the title of my talk, I use Tortoise and Hare. Is not hard power. Iran will never confront any hard power, whether it's Saudi Arabian bombings or Egyptian army or the Americans or Israelis. That is not the way, over the last 35 years, Iran has operated in terms of geopolitics. It works surreptitiously. It works via soft power. The Israelis are bombing 2006 southern Lebanon and destroying everything. Iran is going there with cash to build houses and mosques and schools, and of course tunnels. And rockets, absolutely. So it's a combination of soft power and hard power. But they are outsmarting Joseph Nye so far as the question of soft power is concerned. Now, as I said today, the anxiety of the Arab world has to be dissected between the ruling regimes that, in my opinion, want to put an end to the democratic aspirations of Arab revolutions and those Arab revolutions itself. It is those democratic aspirations that have to remain at the forefront of our analysis and not allowing our analysis to dissolve and to degenerate into the Sunni Shi'i and Persian Arab nonsense that is by virtue of labor migrations from one end of the Arab and Islamic world to another. We don't have pure anything. We don't have pure Arabs. We don't have pure Sunni Shi'is. It's a combination of all of them forced together. And when you look at the revolutionary aspects and aspirations of the Arab revolutions, they were in fact expressing that aspiration. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام والحرية والعدالة الاجتماعية والعيش has nothing to do with Sunni Shi'i or Arab Persian. The rise of the Arab revolutions, in fact, were the return of what the Iranian revolution was for back in 1779, and this is the reason that the ruling regime in Iran called it, oh, this is an Islamic awakening, because they didn't want to realize that it has nothing to do with Islamic awakening, had everything to do with the cosmopolitan disposition of a democratic revolution. To conclude, again, echoing what Dr. Bishara said, we have to recognize the global crisis of the empire. It cannot manage it. We have to understand the ideological collapse of Zionism, the ideological collapse of the so-called two-state delusion, the importance of the BDS giving a new momentum to the Palestinian cause. We have to realize that the ruling regime, both in Iran and in many Arab capitals, are actually united, are identical in their opposition to the democratic aspirations of these revolutions. And in conclusion, in my humble opinion, what needs to be done is not the Arabification of the Palestinian national liberation, but the Palestinification of the Arab revolutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hamid Dabashi, for this intervention. Please, I just want to remind you, we are going on since 9 o'clock. We took all the time allocators and all the time for the break, and I'll give time only for 2-3 questions, please. We do not want to delay proceedings. Please be brief.
Was it indeed peaceful in his own opinion? Would it be possible for this framework agreement to perhaps curb Iran from obtaining military aspects of the program? I would like to take some questions and I will answer them at once. Another question, please. In terms of Dr. Mamdouh, when it comes to Iran, when you talked about the oil reserves, you haven't talked about the gas reserves. Can you hear me? This gentleman saying no. The question is to do with the gas reserves. You have mentioned the oil reserves. Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, the gentleman is repeating the same question and he's asking about the renewable energy. Another question that is to do with Yemen. Would it be possible to win over Yemen, and how long would the air bombardment carry on? Will this military campaign be concluded? Would it be possible to destroy the core of the reactor because it has cost billions of dollars? Is this feasible? Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you. I do think what makes the anxiety of the Arab world more entrenched is, in addition to what has been said, the strategic dimension and the energy dimension. I do think that the Arab countries who do not have a strategic project, they have a neighbor which has a huge energy plan. Those Arab countries who do not have the know-how, if we want, for example, to open a road, we will ask for an expert. However, our neighbor has been able to threaten the region with its own capacity. I have a question. There are two projects. The first project is to do with the national sovereignty, and in the Arab world, the Arab countries are in a defense kind of position. I think the challenge has nothing to do with the repercussions of the framework agreement. However, it is to do with having a plan B in the Arab world for the future. If we carry on the same, then we'll be on the back foot. Thank you. Thank you. Last question, please. Microphone, please. Microphone, please. The question No, I cannot hear the speaker. The question is addressed to Mr. Mamdouh. Mr. Mamdouh has talked about the oil prices and the plummeting prices. You have refused the glut, and you have refused also the slow growth in China, and you have talked about the political dimension. Why would OPEC, for example, be compelled to reduce the production? We know that OPEC produces 1/3 of the consumption of the world, and 2/3 are being produced by other countries. Why OPEC ought to shoulder such brunt? Thank you. I'd like to allow 1.5 minutes for the gentleman. Dr. Mamdouh, please, the floor is yours. I'd like to answer your question that relates to OPEC. OPEC has the responsibility of reducing the production because it is responsible for the production of 40% of the global production. And it has the responsibility of having high prices so that the revenues of its members can be met. This is in the constitution of OPEC. If OPEC reduces the production, then Russia will follow suit, Mexico and Brazil. However, this did not take place. When it comes to the gas, yes, Iran ranked second when it comes to the gas reserves. You are right, I ought to have talked about the gas, but I talked about the oil because we have witnessed reduced prices. Iran will utilize the advanced technology in order to enhance the production of gas and perhaps also to emphasize its exports through Turkey to Europe, and this will be in competition with the Russian gas. The last answer when it comes to the nuclear project, I would like to say this following fact. Iran will get to the nuclear weapon despite this agreement, with deception, with procrastination, with whatsoever. But if it reached the military component, then Saudi Arabia will buy bombs from Pakistan or from North Korea. I think we will be witnessing a nuclear race in the Middle East, despite the fact that Israel had its own arsenal since the 50s of the last century. Mr. Hamid?
Thank you, Marwan. I just wanted to say something about the colleague who mentioned about the source of anxiety. I have no doubt that the internal resources of Arabs from Morocco to Syria, if it is properly utilized, tapped on the scientific and intellectual energy of the Arab people, that they will have nothing to be less than any other nation. But the key to it is internal democratization. You cannot have a tapping into the energy of the young generation intellectual scientists without addressing the internal democratization issue. As I said, yes, Iran has presence in all of these places. One has to have a realistic understanding of it, not exaggerated, and not create a boogeyman that you keep blaming for all the other internal issues. Number one, have a realistic assessment of that soft power. Number two, start democratization within the Arab world. Number three, tap on the extraordinary energy of the Arab scientists, intellectuals, etc.
Thank you, Hamid.
Thank you very much. There were two questions. Would it be possible for the decisive storm operation to conclude the conflict in Yemen from air? And would it be possible for this battle to be concluded in favor of the legitimacy This is the gist of the question. I'll answer as follows. Indeed, when it comes to wars, we can say that the air bombardment is an assistive kind of tool.
Support weapon.
Support, indeed. In order to break the will of the opponent and to push them to compromise or negotiations. This is a very important pillar. Perhaps it seems that the decisive storm is following such a method. In parallel, there is indeed a kind of blockade imposed on the borders between Yemen and Saudi Arabia to avoid infiltrators. However, in Aden, it ought not to have the Houthis and Ali Abdullah Saleh's troops to infiltrate Aden. This was to be implemented earlier, and there was a capacity to follow such plan. The port and the huge capacity, these components ought to have been utilized in order to focus on Aden and then perhaps move to Taz and other cities, and thus gradually we can move from the south to the north. I think these were two military plans, and I think the scenarios are there in their minds. A last point, as a matter of fact, there is a dexterity in following the plans, especially from the air. Some mistakes might be committed. The plane was perhaps destroyed because of a technical error or otherwise. I think there is a cooperation between the troops inside the coalition or the alliance. There is also a blockade on the borders, as I said, that prevents infiltrators, and the Houthis had a plan to infiltrate Saudi Arabia to commit certain acts. If you could give me just 1 minute, please. How would the countries utilize their own resources to sustain their effectiveness? This was the question. I would like to give you an example. In 1991, Iraq's institutions or strength were disintegrated because of the Desert Storm launched by the Americans. In few weeks, things were rebuilt, and I think Saudi Arabia has the experience, and if the experience is being tapped into, then things will be better and the result will be splendid. Dr. Imad, you've got only 1 minute. 3 questions were addressed to me. The nuclear program, the Iranian nuclear weapon, was it peaceful? That's the first question. Another question about the Iraq research, and a third question about the competition between us and Iran. In terms of the first question, I followed the nuclear program, Iranian program, since 1974, and was assigned to do so by the Iraqi government. And I wrote articles on Al Jazeera. I had doubts vis-a-vis the peacefulness or the military side of the nuclear dossier. Why military? Because the uranium, enriched uranium, might end up having a bomb, as well as the plutonium, the weapons grade plutonium, might end up having another kind of bomb. 7 years ago, I had my own doubts because we had no facts on the ground. However, 1.5 years ago, when Iran declared officially that it will not have in place a facility that utilizes the weapons-grade plutonium, then this indeed resembled an end line. When it comes to the uranium, when Iran proved that it will have 5% or 20% of enrichment, this has indeed put an end to reaching a capacity of having a bomb. I would like to answer the question that related to the military dimension, but indeed, a year ago, I had a conviction that in the 90s, Iran had certain objectives and it met them peacefully. When it comes to the Iraq kind of facility, Iran now has agreed to transform this reactor, albeit it costed them dearly. And also the Fordo will be transformed. I think the core to the tune of 40 megawatt by the end of June will be perhaps reduced to 5 megawatt or 10 megawatt. And this will not be beneficial to produce the weapons grade plutonium. In addition to that, Dimona, India, Pakistan, and North Korea, the reactors depend on the fuel horizontally, whereby they can reach the weapon grade plutonium and not perpendicularly. So, the reason being, the fuel ought to be absorbed every 3 months in order to get to the weapons grade plutonium. If it is there for 1 year, then we'll have isotopes that will inflict harm on the plutonium itself. So every 3 months ought to be reabsorbed. So the design will be redesigned and the capacity will be reduced, and Iran has lost indeed money-wise, but the reactor will be used to produce the medical isotopes. Thirdly, I was invited 4 months ago in December to deliver a speech or present a paper in the conference of the ministers of energy, the Arab ministers of energy, and I wanted to talk about the future energy in the Arab world. I had subtitle. I said the prerequisite ought to be equal to the national capacities, and I talked about Doha and Abu Dhabi's cooperation and the South Korean involvement in Abu Dhabi, and I asked how many Emiratis will participate in the building of this nuclear, and the question was posed, but the paper was refused by the Arab ministers. I do believe that the Arabs ought to have their own capacities. The Qataris and the Saudis and the Emiratis ought to depend on themselves. How many specialists in nuclear physics? Perhaps less than 0.5% of the graduates will be facing plenty of problems and will be facing Iran. The other question, do you think that Iran will get to the military dimension of the nuclear weapon? I say no. I'm convinced that they will not get to the bomb. Perhaps during the 60s, we had Shia jurists, and they, when it comes to the jurisprudence, the fiqh, they used to have a debate according to the Shia jurisprudence. Is it allowed? I was surprised in 1980, 1981, the Khomeini has an edict, a fatwa, saying that Iran is prohibited from having the nuclear bomb. In 2006, the Khamenei did the same, and he had declared the fatwa. In 2008 as well, he said the same. In accordance with the Shiite jurisprudence, Iran cannot have the bomb. Thank you very much, Dr. Imad. I have to confess that Running such session was difficult because I wanted to absorb an avalanche of information, and I had to run it judiciously. But at last, I would like to thank Dr. Azmi Bshara, Dr. Hamid Dabashi, Dr. Mamdouh Salameh, Dr. Abdulwahhab Qassab, Dr. Imad Khadduri. I would like to thank you for your patience. Thank you.